Webinar. All right. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Christine Glauber. I'm the chair of the InReach webinar series. And before I introduce today's speaker, does anyone have any announcements they want to share or items that they'd like to share with the group? No? Okay. Well, then we'll go ahead and get started. So I am both honored and very delighted to introduce our guests today who are joining us from the University of California, Irvine, Newkirk Center for Science and Society, the Community-Based Research Initiative. So Connie, Victoria, and I all overlapped at UC Irvine during graduate school. And recently we connected and discovered some really wonderful shared interests and efforts on our professional trajectories. After learning about their teaching, mentoring, and research support efforts in community-based research at UCI and the methods and tools, both explicit and implicit, that are employed in the work, I thought there might be some really great opportunities for the team science and PR worlds to cross-pollinate and share theories and best practices. So, and I'm just gonna, can everyone just make sure that you're muted so that we don't get any feedback? All right. And okay, cool. So, all right, so Connie McGuire is the Director of Community Relationships with the Community-Based Research Initiative at Newkirk Center for Science and Society at the University of California, Irvine. She works on research justice-oriented projects in a variety of settings, including in the struggle for environmental justice. She is a cultural anthropologist and a Latin Americanist by training and teaches community-based participatory research methods course in UCI's undergraduate community engagement minor. Excuse me. Connie is trained in and works as a coach and a guide in several mindfulness-based practices, including yoga, meditation, and Hakomi, a mindfulness-based somatic method for assisted self-study. And Victoria Lowerson Bredow is the Director of Engaged Scholarship with the Community-Based Research Initiative at the Newkirk Center as well. And Victoria co-directs the CBRI with Dr. McGuire, in which they mentor graduate students on research projects in partnership with community-based organizations focused on social and environmental justice. She also implements a year-long workshop on research justice, consults on community engagement efforts, and community-based research projects for other individual groups and organizations. Victoria also teaches in UCI's undergraduate community engagement minor. She received her PhD in planning, policy, and design from the School of Social Ecology at the University of California, Irvine, and her research interests center on inclusion and exclusion as they pertain to production, public management, and policy. Sorry, knowledge production, public management, and policy. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce Connie and Vic, so take it away.
Thank you so much, Christine. And yeah, thanks to those of you on the call, and thanks, Christine, for inviting us to do this. This has been super fun, having conversations that have led up to this moment. So we're really grateful and excited. So first, the title of our webinar is Considering Community-Based Research in Team Science, Boundary Spanning Beyond the University. And we start all of our events with a land acknowledgement, and so this is kind of unusual because we're all in different places, but we're going to acknowledge the land that we're on here at UC Irvine. So UC Irvine is on the ancestral lands of the Tongva and Hashima nations, and we just like to acknowledge that history, which is so often erased, and acknowledge that there's been many, many people here before us, and we wouldn't be there without them. So we're grateful for that. And we also begin all of our events by inviting people to share their gender pronouns. So my gender pronouns are she, her, and Victoria's are she, her. So we'll just share those, and if when you speak you'd like to share yours as well, that's great. So today we have a couple of purposes for the webinar. And one is to explore the idea of thinking about team science beyond the university, and also for thinking about tools, what tools form community-based research might be useful, relevant, and fun for you all to try out in your work as team scientists who do work, kind of do this collaborative work. We just want to say this is one of our first times really starting to present on this aspect of our research, so we're just really excited to be in conversation and get feedback from folks in the team science world. Yeah.
Oh, so to do this, how do I advance this slide? Oh, there we go. I don't know how that happened. So we will start by providing some background. We'll give you a little bit more background on the CBRI, and then share some stories, what we're calling stories of encounters that we have had with team science and CBR, and then share some of the conceptualizing and theorizing we're doing about these encounters. And then in that, some of the tools that we're developing along the way to help us conceptualize that we think would be fun to hear your feedback on, to see maybe some connections that you might see between your work and team science, doing interreach work, and the work that we're doing, which kind of the bridging work between community and campuses. So today we'll be focusing on considering some of the opportunities and costs, benefits and challenges, and discussion with you all. And I think we have a relatively small group, so I'm really excited to be able to have a discussion with you all about that regarding the integration of what we'll call CBR, Community-Based Research, and Team Science, and what we call the science of engaged scholarship as well. So, okay. Yeah. So basically, to tell you all, Connie mentioned that we are just starting to do a lot of this kind of kick off our study, et cetera, is that we began in 2018, so a relatively new initiative. We began with seed funding from the Newkirk Center for Science and Society, and we began in March 2018. And after kind of a long proposal writing phase, Connie and I worked together for many years doing community-based research, specifically on a project locally. And we started off with a strategic planning process to anchor some of our values. And we think it's really important to share those with you, as well as not only what we do, but why we do it. So through our strategic planning process, we landed on some values, which we also consider to always be in process. But our values center on relationships, process, diversity, justice, inclusion, and transformation. And we consider these values kind of anchors to the work that we do.
And so we have, through our strategic planning process, we came up with our 3 components or elements of our initiative. The first one is build capacity. So we do that through mentoring and training in community-based research methods and practices. The second is what we call is practice or doing community-based research. So we partner with organizations outside of the university to conduct and implement, and then also sometimes evaluate community-based research projects. Like right now, we're working on a project related to water, doing a strengths and needs assessment with what are called disadvantaged communities in a watershed to learn about kind of their experiences with water. So always continuing to practice our craft. And then third, and that's really a lot of what we're touching on today, is studying community campus partnerships and community-based research pedagogy. And so this is what we call our meta study. And that's so basically most of our activities from pillars 1 and 2, or elements 1 and 2, are the ethnographic material of our meta study. So any student who comes in to work in our lab, we tell them that you're a part of our study now. You're both doing work in the field, and we're kind of studying this process together and reflecting on it. And we call this the science of engagement. And then also just as background, we wanted to just reiterate that we're both, it was mentioned in our bios, but we're both social scientists and ethnographers, so really qualitative researchers doing a lot of reflective and narrative kind of work.
So the meta study is really like a long-term ethnographic project.
Yeah, very long-term. Yeah, and then we're just going to give kind of our definition of community-based research. So this definition is, you know, not set in stone. It's something we're continually reworking. So we define community-based research as a process of inquiry and knowledge production that emphasizes collaborative processes for developing and answering research questions that are significant for people most impacted by social and environmental problems. So this is one of the basic tenets of community-based research. That interrogates and challenges historical and ongoing practices that produce structural inequities, that aspires to produce knowledge that disrupts extractive or otherwise violent modes of learning and knowing. So, you know, this is the idea of kind of going into a community and taking things out in an extractive way, and that can be, you know, in the process of taking tissues from people's bodies, or it can also be in the process of taking ideas from people in a non-reciprocal way. That centers on caring for relationships between people and between people and their environments as the key element to situating, contextualizing, and enacting knowledge production in community settings. And lastly, it draws from feminist, anti-colonial, and anti-oppressive theories, methods, and movements to create research and pedagogical practices, processes, and products that encode justice into knowledge production. And this idea of encoding justice into knowledge production came to us in a conference, actually, when we were seeing someone's presentation where they were actually talking about making an app, and they were talking about the ways that sort of with the development of the algorithm, certain outcomes are determined, right? And they were talking about inclusion of folks, I think it was people with autism, but so sort of the ways in which how you can encode justice or injustice into your knowledge production practices. So that's sort of where this idea came from.
So now we're going to get into those encounters by sharing 3 short stories about team science and community-based research and their intersection. So we'll start with the team science story. So in 2018, the beginning of our project, we participated in writing a proposal for seed funding for a multidisciplinary center focused on community-based research and environmental and climate justice. There are approximately 7 people and 3 academic staff, and 7 people consisting of 3 academic staff and 4 professors on that team. And in the process of getting that started, we were connected with a scholar of team science who offered to help facilitate the group in support of the proposal writing process. So what this entailed was that we answered a pre-survey sent out by this scholar, which they sent out via email, and this included questions about others in the group, so other scholars in the group, including asking how much we knew about them, about their discipline. The questions seemed geared towards understanding if there was trust in the group and if people knew each other's expertise. We were then convened in person for a focus group, and the scholar, the team science scholar, was the facilitator, and they met us in a conference room, consented us to an IRB, and then asked us questions, and asked us to pair up with people that we didn't know that well in the group and answer a set of questions with each other, and then answer a set of questions on the iPad at the end. So we're actually then enlisted into their study of team science. So a few weeks after this focus group, we received a post-survey asking again about the other people in the group and our perceptions of them, our knowledge of their expertise, some indicators of group dynamics, such as who was taking the lead on certain aspects of the proposal, and if we thought the discussion with the facilitator had been helpful. This experience focused on creating bridges across disciplines so that we would try and start speaking a common language amongst the group and could ultimately successfully obtain funding and implement a successful research project, so kind of continue to collaborate together. The focus group was oriented towards really what we could achieve as a group versus thinking like that what we could achieve as a group was more than what we could achieve as individuals beyond ourselves, and really leveraging each other's expertise to write this proposal. So after participating in this group, we were provided an Amazon gift card, which is great. So now Connie's going to talk about the CBR story, our primary form of research that we do in the center.
So as we mentioned in the 3 elements of our initiative, we mentor graduate students in community-based research in partnerships with community-based organizations. We might not, I didn't maybe get into those details at that point, but that's one of the ways that we do this work, is we mentor grad students. And so this past year, we partnered with a community-based organization, or a CBO, to support the creation of a community-based air monitoring network in their area. So what's entailed in this is researching the kinds of pollutants that are in the air, determining which kinds of air monitors will best measure those types of pollutants, and implementing a study to monitor the pollutants in the air. And in this case, there was a known potential polluter that the community, who's also very well organized and has a long-standing neighborhood association there, that they had learned about through a sort of public disclosure process, and they were in the process of mobilizing this around it as a potential environmental injustice issue. So they do not know yet whether it is an environmental injustice issue, right? They have to do the research in order to figure that out. So the CBO wrote a grant to a regional air quality management agency to propose this community air monitoring program. And they received the grant, which was around $300,000 for a couple of years, and then they proceeded to take steps to begin to set up the program. And the key steps in the process for the organization from their proposal and their sort of way of working was to establish 2 steering committees, one comprised of youth and another one comprised of adults. And these 2 steering committees were to guide the process of those other 3 steps of learning about the contaminants and figuring out what monitors to purchase, and then purchasing monitors in order to establish what the levels of the pollution are and what the potential impacts are. So as a community-based research initiative, our support of the organization has been through the student fellows who work with them to implement the grant. And one student in particular, whose dissertation research is about environmental injustice in Southern California, worked closely with the staff of the organization to develop a curriculum for the steering committee members to learn about air monitoring, environmental justice, and decision-making around these types of environmental concerns. So a key step in the process of the steering committee will be to decide on this air monitoring technology for the neighborhood. So this approach of responding to problems, environmental or social problems, so by building capacity of those most impacted by the problems to make the decisions about its solution, is very common and well accepted and promoted both in community-based research, kind of one of the real tenets of the reason to do community-based research, as well as in community organizing. So now we want to move on to our next story, which is about our experience at this intersection between team science and community-based research.
So more recently, we had the experience of participating in another proposal writing, a cross-campus multidisciplinary RO1 proposal process to submit a grant focused on community-based research. So the grant required the integrated participation of a community partner, and implied that that partner should be a co-PI on the grant to demonstrate the integration from research design through implementation. So the integration of the community partner from research design to implementation, which is really the gold standard in community-based research. We learned about the grant opportunities through the seed grant that I mentioned before. So a couple of scholars from that group of 7 proposed writing the grant as a continuation of that earlier process. So some of the ideas from that, moving forward on those. And the turnaround time for this RO1 grant was only a few months, so things had to move relatively quickly. Many in the group of scholars had experience working with community-based organizations, or CBOs, and some had 10 or more years experience doing community-based research. And at least one person in the group didn't have any, none to our knowledge, experience working with community-based organizations. So really a spectrum of experience. And we joined the grant writing effort because of our relationship with one of the community partner organizations. And as scholar practitioners that on campus, so we represent folks that bridge and coordinate community-based research in addition to studying it. So the two lead researchers, there's two lead researchers from the SEED grant group that kind of started the grant writing process. And they started it by drafting some specific aims and emailing the document out to about 8 potential collaborators. So some new people in there. And then bringing other university researchers to a subsequent in-person meeting. So some people provided comments at the meeting, and some people replied in comments before the meeting via email, in text, Word stuff, and other people didn't respond. It wasn't kind of clear. The lead faculty members asked to meet with Connie and I to do like a one-on-one with us to discuss what our role might be in the grant. And, still this is within the first almost year of our initiative. We're still getting some clarity in terms of the different hats we could fill in these proposal writing processes. So in our meeting, we basically provided the history of our relationship with the organization. We had been working with them for 10+ years. We also discussed our positions in the university. So we're not faculty members, we're research staff, and kind of our career trajectories to talk about PI, potential lead researcher status, et cetera. And so we basically came to the agreement that from our team, I would be the co-investigator and Connie would participate in what they were forming a community advisory board. And they asked if we thought the community partner would be interested in the research and asked that we meet with a community partner, kind of be that bridge, and explain the research idea, the proposal process. So I met with them accordingly, and when I met with the lead person from the CBO, my point of contact there, they told me that one of the faculty leads had also reached out to them. And so there was a little bit confusion on all sides from the CBO, from the faculty, from us in terms of the roles and responsibilities at that point. So at the next proposal development meeting, we invited the community partner to attend the meeting in person, and then another organization also attended. I ended up calling in via Zoom, which ended up being pretty challenging because there were some hard copy documents that were circulated that weren't circulated electronically. And so the organizations and many researchers, as well as the leads, were trying to understand what role they might play. So we're just kind of really trying to figure that out. At this meeting, we also brought up the issue of equity in terms of ensuring that community organizations were also equally compensated for their time. We were having to do a budget in this process. So getting equal compensation is also a key feature of community-based research. So in the subsequent meetings, questions about roles and responsibilities continued to emerge, and then this rolled into conversations about PI status, COI, the community advisory board, as well as budget, kind of nexus of the three. Ultimately, one of the community organizations was listed as a PI, and during the proposal writing process, going back to the point that people were not clear as to what level of feedback to give on those documents that were circulating because they weren't clear about their role. There were also people of different university statuses, junior assistant faculty, senior faculty, there's academic staff, department chairs, et cetera, which, play a role in determining capacity. And played a role in determining capacity, as some folks, there was at least 4 research staff on the proposal, all of whom, being on staff money, had previous commitments that affected their capacity to participate at that moment in a short time frame. So that's one example of where, as CBR scholars and practitioners, we've experienced this kind of intersection of team science coming together with community-based research. And we have a second example that we want to share briefly.
So another example is we were asked to join a group of scholars from across campus to write a letter of intent for a large center scale grant. And we were brought into this process by a PhD level grant / development coordinator person. So sort of I think an interreach person, like she might be on the call. They were really looking for community engagement experts in order to help support the public impact engagement component of the application, which was a requirement. And an important distinction between this process and the previous one is this was a letter of intent and not a full proposal, so there was not a budget at this stage. So this person managing the LOI and bringing people together did acknowledge that the budget might be a sticking point. but it was something that we didn't yet have to deal with. It was like a bridge we didn't have to cross yet. So in this case, the stakes were quite different in the two groups, and the timeline was also different than the case that Victoria mentioned. So the striking difference here was that there was a person whose focused job was to work to bring together the scholars of different disciplines, as well as to bring everything together administratively. And so, you know, in reflecting on the two examples and preparing for this webinar, we were really struck by the different feelings we had about each process, and the first being much more challenging and the second being smoother. And sort of the key differences that we noted in the two scenarios were, one, this point of contact. The point of contact in the second case really helped we just always knew who we could reach out to, and they were very responsive to us, and weren't, you know, their job was really to attend to everybody in the group. Also the document sharing and document management. So in the first case, there was lack of clarity about version control, lack of clarity about how to give feedback or when it was appropriate to give feedback, and that related to kind of who you were in the room, I think. And in the second case, we were all working on shared Google Docs, and there were clear instructions when it was like, okay, no more editing right now because we're going to try to do something, and then it was like, okay, now we're open for editing again. But also in the second case, the community partners were not in the room yet, right? So we were sort of representing the potential community partners, but they weren't actually there, so that power dynamic wasn't yet sort of being talked about. Mm-hmm. And then again, the money issue, the budgeting issue wasn't on the table yet in the second case. Mm-hmm. So these are just kind of things we're starting to see, sort of what the different dynamics are in the team science scenarios, and sort of some of the overlaps with the CBR. So we know we're likely preaching to the choir here, and we really love that visual, the inner reach visual of the arrow inside the person, kind of the person figure, because it really represents the work that's required to create this sort of trust and synergy, to create both the kind of like a positive process as well as an outcome in these team science settings. Mm-hmm. So next we wanted to talk a little bit about, in considering these three stories, we've been doing some conceptual work to try to understand and explain both the dilemmas and the community-based organizations are facing as they try to respond to injustices and threats to their health and livelihood, like for the example of air pollution, as well as to conceptualize what exactly it is we're doing as we support organizations and graduate students to work together on social and environmental problems. So some of our takeaways from these conundrums and trying to get into concepts are knowledge making is highly specialized and complex. Both experiential knowledge of problems as well as technical expertise are required to address complex problems that most impact historically marginalized communities. Power dynamics are continually at play in the creation of knowledge and partnerships both within the university and when crossing boundaries outside of the university. So we began to try to conceptualize and get clarity about two things: the relationship between different kinds of knowledge and knowledge production in community-based research, as well as the relational work involved in doing community-based research in ways that align with our CBR definition and values. Mm-hmm. And so these things kind of come into sharp relief in the team science setting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So now basically we're going to share some conceptual tools that we've been using to both help us conceptualize our engagement with our partner CBO, as well as take action in the field as partners with them in the search for information that might help them move forward in identifying their problems and moving towards solutions.
So we call these next 3 slides, or 2-3 slides, Venn Diagram play. So we've been playing around with kind of sort of creating boundaries around different things and trying to figure out how they relate to each other. So we call this one sort of a model of a traditional research dynamic, traditional university-community relationship. So you can see in the top we've got technical expertise, which typically can come from universities or other large institutions, and then kind of the community is at the bottom circle. And in this setting, information flows from technical experts to the community, from producers to consumers. and knowledge production happens in the academic institution or other large institution, and then it's applied to or taken up by those who are interested and can use the findings. And so there's shared boundaries and avenues that connect the two, but there's not a lot of overlap. So there's kind of maybe a touch there at the edge. And in some cases, this, as I was mentioning at the beginning, in some cases, this kind of dynamic is critiqued as being extractive. And so that's what the green arrow is, which is like the pulling out of things that get turned into knowledge from the community. Yeah, next slide. And so then this is another, a newer one that we came up with. So what we're calling common conception of the goals of authentic community participation or inclusion in processes. So here the two circles, sort of the technical expertise circle is kind of, the community circle takes over the technical expertise circle. So the community takes a lead role, replacing those in power, such as decision makers. Conceptions of power is very possessive, so it's something that one has or does not have. So in this case, you know, the community is sort of taking the power over from the technical experts with their experiential expertise. And the goal is the transfer of power and leadership and decision making to communities most impacted, right? So this is a very, you know, very common in the community organizing world, right? This is kind of the strategy, the political strategy. And in this case, technical experts become advisors to a community-driven process. So they're really peripheral to the process. And so so here we're sort of using a more traditional Venn diagram here to try to demonstrate what it is we think we're trying to do in this work and kind of how we see these things relating. So we kind of move the technical expertise and the community expertise into a horizontal working relationship, bringing power and interest into the same plane here. There's a two-way flow of information that happens, or actually like a synthesizing of knowledge that happens in that arrow into the overlap or intersection of expertise. And then there's this overlap of technical and academic expertise and community expertise, and out of which comes that synthesis, right? So the point here is that this is relevant. So in terms of this conversation, this is relevant not only in CBR, but also in team science settings and in team science, so not only in the intersection of CBR and team science, but also in team science in general. The questions of how different knowledge or knowledges intersect or overlap and relate to one another is a fundamental team science question, and also a fundamental science with community-based research, right? So we're seeing these overlaps. Yeah,
this intersection, like it kind of has similarities to the kind of transdisciplinary approaches to research too. So I'm going to talk about the next way we've been kind of conceptualizing and theorizing these stories is through the idea of relational work to conceptualize the relationships between knowledge and people. So this relates to kind of what Connie mentioned earlier regarding how we kind of take action in the field as partners and mentors bridging the university and community. So what we're thinking about is that relational work kind of makes some assumptions about social phenomena, and we're kind of seeing those ring true with the way in which we, the values, like we mentioned earlier. So when we talk about social phenomena, we also include from a science and technology studies perspective, both science, medicine, technology to be social phenomena. And so that means that those phenomena can be understood through the relationships between skills, resources, orientations, and actions of groups and individuals in the transactions and actions that actually reproduce and produce those relationships. So we kind of think of things, social phenomenon, to always be in relation to other multiple, either objects or people. So, and we're also playing with this idea of a process view, which also rings back to our values, to see the world is made up of processes. So instead of thinking of things as static, we think about social phenomena as an ongoing effort for accomplishment. So this also means that things are created and recreated through process, and this includes boundaries. So boundaries as things, so boundaries between campus and community, between disciplines. So these are always kind of in constant negotiation, and there's lots of things that constrain and enable why boundaries persist or how boundaries can be transformed. So some of the ways that we're actually seeing that this is happening for us, and that we're talking about our study, so how are we actually doing this? And then what are the kind of things that we're learning from it? Are activities including like attending to the relationships continuously. So for us, this means doing quarterly meetings with community partners. It means that the fellows have regular check-ins with these community partners, and that we are trying to find a relationship management software so that attends to the ongoing, attends to our kind of our orientation to kind of seeing a relationship as something that needs continuous support and attention. Another way is that we attend to the various features of the relationship. So, power is definitely something that came up in what Connie was just mentioning in terms of the Venn diagram. So we're kind of attending to various features of the relationship, and particularly power. I mean, it's well known in the kind of community-based research world that power is very much important. And we do this through reflection activities in our regular meetings with our fellows. And I think Christine mentioned this, and we do like the year-long research justice fellowship that's going to be rolled out this year, which has a year-long workshop series. And in those workshop series, we have like worksheets and things that help to bring those things, make those things more visible. So in conjunction with doing the conceptual work, we've been developing and piloting tools like these worksheets to support both the conceptual work for ourselves, for our students, and with collaborators at the university and outside the university. So we want to talk and kind of show you some of those different tools that we've been developing and piloting and experimenting with that relate to the different conceptualizations that we've just gone through. So both the Venn diagram and this kind of relational work. So we have 3 conceptual tools that we're going to go through. We have a Venn diagram worksheet, a listening worksheet, and a collaboration matrix. So the worksheet on the Venn diagram, Connie's going to talk about, and then the worksheet on the listening focuses on helping academics work in relationship with community partners, and then the collaboration matrix, which probably is familiar to you all in organizing multiple disciplines to work together. But we're like really in process of using that with a current community collaborative. And like I said, we'll share screenshots with each, and we're happy to kind of send the actual documents afterwards.
So this is a tool, so again, you'll recognize the Venn diagram, and we used this it was actually in a community building workshop, part of the research justice pilot series that we did in the winter and the spring this year. And basically we were supporting, there's 2 sides, so there's 2 slides and 2 sides to the worksheet. And basically we were supporting people to kind of students, so basically it's oriented for students who come to the workshop to kind of think through, usually they either are interested in doing research in a community-based organization or they already are. And so in this case, we developed this worksheet to help researchers reflect on how we think about the relationship between communities and university-based researchers. So we just basically added some prompts to kind of help people think through things. And so we don't need to go through all of the questions, but basically, so, thinking about discipline, right? So how does your discipline relate or not to the communities that are involved or implicated in the results of your research, of your field's research? In your research field, how do researchers usually relate or talk about the relevant communities, right? So like, is the community a part of the conversation in your field or not? So we have in these workshops, just to give context, we are, and as the Newkirk Center for Science and Society, our mandate is to work across campus. So we're trained as social scientists, but we are really reaching out to, so we've got students who are in biology and physics, we've got people from the medical school, and we have social scientists and people, who've been trained in community-based research. So there's a real range. And some people are in departments where, there's not a conversation happening about this. And that's also one of kind of our reasons for existing, is that we're kind of filling a gap there. So that we sort of ask these questions and then ask them to reflect on why that might be, does your situation relate to this configuration? And then the same with the other side. So I think in this section, we want to ask, think about community expertise, so the knowledge and experience that non-technically trained people have about a topic or a problem. technical expertise and the knowledge that's derived from scientific processes of data collection and analysis, and the overlap or intersection of the synthesis of these two experiences. So we kind of break those down, right? The three parts of the Venn diagram, and ask the participants to reflect on those. Mm-hmm. And actually, I was really surprised when we used this tool. Especially the more experienced folks actually found it to be really challenging to respond to these prompts, and it made them think a lot. So that was curious for us and exciting to think about. It kind of it brought up a lot of conversation. So.
Yeah, I could see definitely. So one of the things the relationship with like the community expertise is that these tools are also very malleable. The community expertise could be transferred to being different disciplinary expertise, which is kind of what we experienced in that team science encounter. Right. We were asked to reflect on other people's expertise. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to talk about the listening worksheet now. So this is focused on the supporting the relationship building muscle, I'd say. This is actually a 6-page worksheet that has a series of prompts that we used in a workshop focused on setting up a partnership with a community-based organization, and we focused on skills including listening, reflecting, and documenting. So there's a series of prompts that can be tailored to the researchers, both topically as well as to the extent that they have a relationship already with the organization, as well as to the stage they are in that relationship. Maybe they're already at data collection, et cetera. The questions focus on both before the meeting with the community-based organizations, during the meeting, and then after. You can see this first one is focused on like your first meeting. So I've kind of selected a couple that relate to some of the conceptual work that we talked about today. But like I said, we can share the full worksheet at the end. So some of the questions that explicitly focus on knowledge production and relationships and power are the ones that I've selected here. And so questions such as asking folks, what kind of research and knowledge is important to my partner's work? What is it that I want my partners to know about me and my work? Is there an established relationship between the university and this community partner already? Kind of like, what is the history that I'm walking into? And then how can this partnership align our priorities and benefit everyone? So like thinking about that intersection piece too that Connie mentioned. So another part of the sheet that I wanted to pull out was more of an attention to power dynamics. So asking explicitly students to think about what power dynamics might be at play. So how do my and my community partners' identities, including race, class, gender, education, level of education, institutional role, et cetera, and prior experience shape how my partner and I relate to one another? What assumptions might my partner have about me? Do I have any unexamined assumptions about them? And then what practical and logistical constraints should I consider? So like, what are the constraints put on different people? A lot of times this comes with like timing, right, is a big constraint. So really explicitly asking students to reflect on these power dynamics. I think the evaluations we did through the workshop were things that people they maybe had anxiety about after or before they were doing their work, but they never kind of took the time to actually kind of do some activities on it and do some explicit work towards it. So.
And then last but not least, we haven't actually used this tool yet, but we've developed it. And so this is what we call our collaboration matrix. It's like a collaborative management tool that we developed for a collaboration between, so you can see down the left column are the kind of different groups of people, and sort of a unit would be in a different color, and then there'll be multiple people underneath each under each category, right? So community-based organization, there might be leads there, and then there might be members of the youth steering committee, and their names would be there, and then other community members. And then like us, our names would be under Community-Based Research Initiative. And then you basically kind of go across and think in the different categories of work that we're all trying to do together on a collaborative research project coming from really different fields. Kind of like what is it that we think that, so we say, in each box, write lead or support in terms of your relationship to any given activity. So like in the category of administrative or collaborative management, in the category of engaging with residents, in the category of research activities or in the category of purpose and vision. And so our plan, we have we'll have a meeting with this collaborative group. We kind of meet quarterly. Is that before that next meeting, we've proposed this idea to them and said we would email it to them before the next meeting so that people can kind of go through and just to get on the same page about, especially on that purpose and visions part, kind of why are you working on this in this university collaborative, kind of like what are your stakes here? What do you think we're doing here? What's the purpose of this group in your, in your words? And then what do you see as your principal contribution to the group? And so this is a shared Google Drive, a Google document, so people can also see each other's responses, obviously, and I'm sure that will impact how people respond. Hopefully they will respond. That's also often the real challenge with emailing things to people if they're so busy. But yeah, so this is a tool we're experimenting with. My guess is that in team science there's other similar tools, but I'd be curious to hear if there are. We just kind of made it up. So yeah.
So that's really the end of our presentation, and like we started off with, where we are in the development of our research project. We're really excited to have this discussion with you all, hear your questions, comments, your reflections, hear some suggestions, and possibly make connections with you and things that you suggest. So thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. This was really great. I want to, just reiterate, thank you. I think there's some really awesome stuff that came out of this. So I want to open it up for questions for the group. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask Connie and Victoria?
Hi, this is Christine Hendren. I'm also at Duke, and I thought that was a fantastic presentation as well. What you said at the very end really resonated with me, where you said, you're sure there's tools out there, but you just kind of made it up, and that describes kind of most of my career, I think, and why so many of us are drawn toward connecting with other people who probably are trying to grapple with these same, matrices, all these different considerations. I was wondering, I loved how you presented a lot of the different relational pieces, and I was wondering if you had any insight you could gain or share with us about making the case to maybe academics or medical professionals, or when you're really kind of trying to translate the equal power that needs to be shared across community partners and the traditional, like starting point of generating information, which has been traditionally thought of as living in the ivory tower. Do you ever find that you have to kind of push that concept and re-educate and kind of get over kind of a boundary where it's just not quite sinking in? And any strategies for doing that for people who kind of see this as maybe, I don't want to say, but like hippie or, touchy-feely, or things that they use in a disparaging way that we might think are only good. Anyway, I think all of us have probably faced that skepticism and wondered if you have any practical advice, or maybe you haven't faced that.
So definitely can relate to that situation.
Well, my first reaction is to try to really listen and understand exactly what the person's kind of where that is coming from for them, and if there's, that's kind of usually my first approach, is because it obviously, when you're being disregarded, basically it can create a lot of defensiveness. So I try to kind of be like, okay, where is this coming from the person, so that I would just say there's kind of like some listening techniques that can kind of come into play. I think another thing that we do is, cite the research, right? Like, so, if that's really the language that the person is talking, like being like, okay, this is established, like, NIH is requiring this, kind of go on, get into kind of like where this is coming from and backing it up with like the things from within the university that are the language that the person speaks. And then, I think other things are kind of using stories of like success, right, and failure to kind of make contrasts So those would be three things that come to mind. I don't know if you have, I'm trying to think of a specific story, but.
Yeah, I feel like from the last story we talked about from the LOI process, actually, I felt like we did a little bit of that because we, got brought in, like we mentioned, to be like, there was, usually a section on like public impact or community engagement. And then what does that really mean gets talked out when you get brought to the table a little bit. And I think we had to describe kind of what that could mean. And we thought like, we talked about it as like a thread that could go through each of these and like really concretely, I think, in some ways people were open to it, but they just necessarily didn't have the language to talk about it. So like, what did it mean to like bring a community partner specifically in to kind of give feedback on something in, I don't know, like water infrastructure? And it's like, well, we have some great examples from what we're doing. So bringing in the story, we tell the story of research that we're doing a lot to give really concrete examples of that. And we've talked about, so that experience resonated with me because I felt like we did have to kind of do some explaining, and then we didn't have to cite the literature that much in that example. In other instances, we've had to use the literature to kind of, talk at that I don't know, register, I guess. But I think what happened in most examples that there were some like hidden allies in the room that came out when we started talking about things that maybe, their expertise wasn't on kind of CBR, but they had maybe worked on one project with CBR, was really interested in it. So there was like this, there was a space in which it could come out. And I think it also helped having that person there who was coordinating the grant proposal, who was almost like the neutral facilitator who could receive that. And it wasn't necessarily being received by a faculty member, but it was received through somebody else.
Yeah, and one other thing, I mean, just piggybacking on that, I think there's kind of a, it's like getting to that part of the person who is like the reason that, the reason that people are doing the work that they're doing, right? They have these very like particular technical questions that they're interested in, but like the real reason that they're, they're kind of like, why did they go into academic pursuits in the first place, right? It's to answer questions that impact the world and like, try to make the world a better place. So these kind of like big kind of universally connecting things. So it's kind of like finding an avenue into that with the person, which is also kind of what you're listening for. Like I was saying, you're like trying to understand like, what is it that this person cares about? And usually it can connect to like this kind of like human impact element of the work, right? So.
That was a fantastic answer. I feel like you just paint a picture for me in my head of first check yourself, check the person, what they need, recite the literature, and then get real concrete about some people want what am I getting out of it? Some people want concrete about what exactly is the process. So that's amazing. I feel like you just verbally wrote a paper for me. Thanks.
Hey there, this is Erin Eckhart from the EPA in Raleigh-Durham. I am a trained kind of environmental scientist, planetary scientist, and never had really any social science background. And I've recently drank the Kool-Aid on kind of human-centered design, design thinking, kind of everything we've been talking about. And so I, as someone that has very little social science experience, is kind of trying to implement this at the US EPA. And it's been met with a lot of pushback. And, I've heard from all different levels of administration, oh, we're a regulatory agency, it's the government, this is never going to happen. And, I've tried to kind of do it on kind of applied science projects that we already have, kind of in retrospect, had we done this, how would it have benefited these projects? And those things have been shut down because as soon as I try to start talking to people as someone that works for the US government, or I start to talk to other federal employees as somebody at the US government, everyone freaks out. And so I guess I kind of wanted to ask a couple questions. One, have you guys kind of met any success in doing this kind of in one of the more regulatory agencies. I know you said the NIH is doing this. I also know that NASA Applied Sciences and NOAA are also starting to kind of talk about these things, which is exciting. And that's the type of thing that I can kind of cite here at the EPA. You know, it's saying everyone's starting to do this. You know, we're going to be behind the times, guys. But yeah, have you had success with more regulatory agencies like the EPA? And I guess my other part of advice is, as someone that is the, you know, is the physical scientist that's trying to kind of bridge this gap and realizing that, you know, physical-based research is no longer for me, what kind of opportunities are there for people like me that want to be kind of that middleman? And I've kind of looked at things like on IDEO and how to be, you know, how to take training for human-centered design and how to lead these things. I mean, I've done a lot of kind of participatory design workshops for environmental conservation, and I'm trying to kind of do that within my team of scientists here. But I have to remember that I'm still a scientist, and yeah, any kind of insight you guys could provide would be really helpful. One tool or one other group that's doing trainings that might be of interest, they're at Vanderbilt University, and they, I think they're out of a, maybe they were originally, anyway, I'm trying to think if they're a translational science unit or not. Are they?
I think they are.
But they have a model that they call the Community Engagement Studio. And you might look them up in terms of that. I mean, that's definitely in terms of particularly around research. I wasn't sure from your question if you're talking about particularly about research or more broadly about community engagement, or kind of where that's fitting in, but that's particularly a method for supporting researchers to basically learn how to get feedback on their research proposals from the communities who are sort of most implicated, impacted, et cetera, by the research. So, you know, these can be like all different kinds of topics. And it's sort of, it's supposedly, it's not technically research, it's more like a quality improvement project. That's kind of what it gets housed under. So it doesn't, so the actual studio, the studio is like a focus group, basically, with a group of people who kind of give the researcher feedback on their research design. And so I'm not, if that could be relevant for you, or there just might be things in there that would be relevant for the work you're doing at the EPA, depending on what it is.
Or changing the language a bit, you know, to use language that would be deemed safe in that environment, whether it's like quality improvement or, you know, I'm just trying to think, you know, versus human-centered design, you know.
The other one that seems that I feel like the scientists here seem to be a little bit more friendly towards is using like the tech terms like user experience, user research. Totally. I think that, you know, citing kind of, you know, all these tech companies do this. It's tried and true. It's almost mandatory that the employees go through these types of trainings. That seems to be working a little bit more than kind of relating it more. When I start to say like design or community or participation, that's when I get the pushback and the skepticism from physical scientists. I mean, I'm basically
So one thing that came to mind that I'm not like, I feel like it's just like one, I'm not sure if it's the right connection, but kind of scenario-based interactions, right? So that seems to be used in like a lot of environmental planning, like adaptation planning and those type of things. And that is a little bit similar. I mean, the community engagement studio is like, it's not a focus group, but you know, it looks like a focus group. It's just people in a room talking about a thing. But the scenario, I think the scenario-based modeling or those type of things could bring in those kind of social elements, but not leading with them in a way, but it's used a lot, I think, in like environmental planning and things like that, that might be another like entry point. And I'm just pulling this out of like many years ago, going to a conference where this issue came up about like trying to bring in kind of community-based planning into like more regulatory agencies. And so I participated in like a scenario, just to experience it. And so it felt like it was legitimated, but I'm not familiar enough to say yes, but that could be another avenue or framing of it too, to explore. And also thinking about the softball work.
Yeah.
So
I had one other question. Let me know if I'm hogging. I know you said there was about 14 of us or something, but I guess my last question is, so I've kind of seen, whether it be kind of in the literature or stuff that's come out on the NRH listserv, I know that there's a conference in Sweden, is it later this month or whatnot, and it's, I keep hearing, whether that be kind of how I was talking about how NASA, NOAA, colleagues of mine, everyone's kind of starting to circle the drain on that we need to do this for physical sciences. But how do we do this? How do we train scientists? Who does this? Where do we get the funding? What comes out of this? And so everyone's starting to talk about this, but I'm finding kind of, in looking for like future positions for myself, as someone who doesn't have kind of classic training in this, in the meantime, kind of the different types of opportunities, so that when this kind of field of, when this is something that's like very accepted in the physical science world, maybe that be 5 to 10 years from now, everybody drinks the Kool-Aid and all applied science start with working with their communities first before basic science is developed. What kind of, I guess, opportunities and trainings would there be in the meantime for someone that already has a PhD, or someone that can't come, unfortunately, to like the grad student classes or workshops at Irvine? Whether that be through like different trainings or getting more experience in like, science communication, or I guess the skill set, for like resume building, that, someone that could come in and kind of show that they have the cred to do it.
Well, I think
I'm going to get another PhD.
Right. Yeah, I think it's getting into the conference circuit is probably the best way. That would be my advice. And then through that, you may learn. I don't know specifically. Like, we were thinking about trying to launch some kind of online training at some point. That's kind of, in our 5-year goals. We would love to do that, to be able to reach more folks and kind of fill this gap and share the knowledge and stuff. But I think in the meantime, it's kind of, there's some different conferences that might be of interest. Do you want to mention, and Victoria just noted, so I'll let her say it.
Oh, no. So I just want to write something down. Okay. Yeah, so we attended this, it's a European, so I know that we have very different constraints being in the US context, but like we went to a European conference called Living Knowledge, which is focused on this European idea of science shops. So where so the science shop is located, like most of science shops are located in the university, but they receive research questions from community groups, outside organizations. It varies widely. And biannually, they convene basically the folks that do that work, that receive those questions, like manage the science shops, more or less. And they have like a summer school that we attended, and they offer that every year. There's also, because there's been a build out of the community-based research kind of by discipline, there's work in public health. So I have an MPH, so that's kind of where this started for me, getting more formalized in it. But so like community campus partnerships for health from the academic stuff. But then the kind of founders of the different disciplinary focuses on this, sometimes they'll have like summer institutes and things like that. So I do feel like these opportunities tend to be relatively like localized in some ways. That sometimes there isn't, kind of a kind of nationwide training that I can think of right now, but this is something that we tend to come across a lot, and would be happy to like share back when we see them or when we remember them. When I'm,
Right.
tonight, and I'm like, oh, that's what I should have
Exactly.
said.
That's the connection. That's reminding me too. We're in the process of developing a community-based research study guide with our library. And like that's the kind of thing we could also include in that, like these are the organizations that hold conferences around community-based research, and like you can click through here. So but a study guide too, just in terms of like your own, you know, reading and learning, we can send that link out as soon as it's up. So study guide is like, you know, the library guide. They create a page with all the different kind of like key citations or key places to check out for information about a different topic.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. A lot of people in Europe are also working closely with their regulatory agencies, so it's kind of the cross-cultural perspective can be really helpful. And people, so
yeah, we met someone from a U.S. agency, was a U.S. governmental agency. One of the ones you mentioned was at Living Knowledge when we were there a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
As well as folks who had been funded by them, and you know, so there was a handful of Americans there, and Canadians,
and people from South America too.
Yeah.
So not just Europe.
All right. Well, thank you both so much again for tuning in, well, for presenting, and thanks to everyone who tuned in on the call. Just a quick reminder that, yeah, so here's all of the contact information if you're interested in connecting with Victoria. And then just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and that we will be posting it onto the InterReach website in the next week or so. And if you have any suggestions for future webinars, please feel free to contact me. It's christine.glauber@duke.edu. So thank you again, Connie and Vic. Really appreciate it. This was really informative.
Yes, thank you, and thanks to you all for your questions. And anything you want to email us, we'd love to hear your suggestions or any other feedback, for sure.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Bye.